All right, welcome back. It's video 2 in the G video series on rock types. We've covered igneous rocks, and now we're going to move on to sedimentary rocks. These are all rocks that form from sediments that are compacted. Sediments are essentially bits of stuff, whether it's rock or a living thing, and compacted means squished. And so let's take a look at a short little video here that introduces us to some of those concepts.
Lighter particles, such as sand, are suspended in the water. Larger grains and pebbles are pushed along the bottom. The faster the river flows, the more it can carry. In this way, fragments of rock are transported towards the sea. This demonstration illustrates what happens when they get there. The sand and pebbles in the guttering are behaving as if they were in a river. The tank at the end is the sea. Where they meet, the flow of water slows down. It no longer has the energy to carry its load, and the particles fall to the sea floor, forming sediments which gradually build up over time. Over the years, these sediments get squashed and compressed and harden to form our second type of rock. Two clues for spotting sedimentary rock are grains and layers. This one is called sandstone. All sedimentary rocks are formed under the sea, but they aren't all made of sand. Limestone is made from the shells and bones of sea creatures and corals. As they die and fall to the seabed, they build up over time to form new rock.
So not all sedimentary rock is made out of bits of rock, although a lot of it is. Some of it's made out of living things as well. But generally what happens is, over the course of millions of years, layers and layers and layers of sediment are piled up in a shallow sea or a lake, and you end up with thick layers of sedimentary rocks. And in order to make them solidify into decent actual rocks, there needs to be a fair bit of pressure pushing down on them from above. So it could be other layers of rock above it, or it could be just an extended amount of time sitting underneath some of those layers, and it cements them, it compacts them and cements them together. So what we end up with is two different kinds of sedimentary rock, as they mentioned in that video. Clastic, which are sedimentary rocks that form from bits of rock, essentially, and organic sedimentary rocks, which form from living things. So let's start with clastic. These basically form from pebbles and sand, silt or mud. Silt is like a very, very fine sand, and mud is even finer than silt. And so when some of those sediments come together, they will form various types of sedimentary rocks. So for instance, a conglomerate, key word there is glom. If something gloms onto you, then it means it's kind of sticking to you. And conglomerates are made up of various size bits of rock. Sometimes they're pebble size, sometimes they're the size more like of a stone, or even larger. And they're cemented together. Usually they kind of look like cement, in fact. And you can even see some places where old rocks have fallen out of that sedimentary conglomerate matrix there. Sometimes these are fairly large. You can see this one here's pretty good size, and this is probably based upon how round most of these rocks are. It was probably in a river environment, and so you end up with once that river either changes course or dries up or stops running or gets buried very deep, these rock layers become conglomerates and will eventually cement together because they're being compacted. The next type of clastic sedimentary rock that we'll look at is a sandstone. That one's pretty obvious. It's made of sand. And so if you look at a sandstone, it's basically a bunch of sand grains that have been compacted and cemented together. And those form many layers that are often visible once they get exposed by erosion. And this formation here is in the desert of Utah, but there are places where there are sandstone layers that are literally hundreds or thousands of feet thick, and they're just accumulated piles of sand, essentially, that have been compressed and cemented together. And then our final type of sedimentary rock we'll look at in the clastic side of things is what's known as a mudstone or a shale. Also, you might hear it called a siltstone. And basically, these are made of very, very fine particles of silt or mud, and uh, and when they're compressed together, they form these sort of flat, very, very fine-grained rocks that often are used for decorative purposes in gardens and those kind of things to use as stepping stones and that sort of thing. But oftentimes in these layers, in between the layers of mud in a lake or in a shallow sea, in between those layers of mud there might be leaves or even bones or shells of animals, and so you end up with a lot of fossils showing up in mudstones because it traps those layers or traps those fossils in between those layers. So a mudstone or a shale or a siltstone, those are the finest of the clastic ones. So larger pebbles and rocks in a conglomerate, sand size sediment in a sandstone, and very, very fine sediment in a mudstone or a shale or a siltstone. But not all sedimentary rocks are made of bits of rock. Sometimes they're made of bits of living things. And so organic, which we often think of, when we think organic, we often think of organic food, which means, it doesn't have pesticides used to grow it, and it costs a little bit more in the grocery store. But organic in general just means living things. It came from something living. And so organic sedimentary rocks are made from dead living stuff. So limestone is a great example of this. Limestone basically forms in the sea, in the ocean, from the shells and bones of very wide variety of sea creatures. Some of them large, some small, sometimes coral, sometimes small fish or very small things with shells. And when those die, the bones or shells sink to the bottom and pile up and eventually cement together. Again, they're compacted and cement together to form these layers of limestone. And over time, they can form some pretty decent sized cliffs like this one here. Not huge, but limestone can be extremely thick. It can be hundreds of feet thick in places as well. And limestone is used oftentimes to make sculptures, or sometimes used in buildings. And unfortunately, what that means is that those things erode away because limestone erodes very easily due to chemical erosion. So in rain, especially near larger cities where they burn a lot of coal and other fossil fuels, you can get acid rain, and the acid in the rain will actually chemically weather that limestone. And so this used to be a very detailed sculpture of a beautiful woman. And look what happened. It's terrible. I don't know, maybe it was a gargoyle, but still, you can see that the erosion is happening on limestone. And limestone cliffs can actually contain some really neat looking features because of the way that it weathers chemically. So there's limestone. Chalk is another form of organic sedimentary rock. And chalk, if you look at it, it's really fine particles that make this thing up. If you look really, really close with a very powerful microscope, what you'll find is that these very fine particles are not bits of silt or sand. They're actually the shells of microscopic living creatures, mostly protists, various types of protists. And those, over millions of years, float down, or I should say sink down, to the bottom of the ocean or a shallow sea. As these little creatures die, their shells sink down like dust almost and pile up like dust, kind of like dust in your house, but it's dust on the bottom of the sea. And what happens is, over millions of years, you can get pretty thick piles of dust, like these ones here in the White Cliffs of Dover. These are, this is basically hundreds of feet thick of chalk, and these are just billions upon billions upon billions of tiny shells from microscopic sea creatures. And they just pile up underneath the sea. Eventually, when the sea level drops, or in this case, the sea level dropped and the land was raised up as well due to tectonic movements and forces, you can end up with these enormous cliffs of chalk. Pretty amazing that these are built of the remains of living things. Whoa. So there you have it. Organic sedimentary rocks. So clastic and organic, the two main types of sedimentary rock. Again, most of these form from sediments simply being compacted and then cemented together. Next up, in our next video, we will move on to metamorphic rocks, and we'll see you there.